Well, here we are as the Karen Read murder trial enters its final phase. WBZ reporter Kristina has been in the courtroom for every minute of this riveting trial, and she joins us now to talk as the jury has the case. Kristina, testimony is done. The judge has given instructions. What has it been like so far this week?
This week has been unlike any other week of trial. I mean, this has been a 9-week trial now, 10 if you count jury selection. And this week, there are between 200 and 400 Free Karen Read supporters outside on this very main road, kind of camping out, tailgating almost by their cars every day outside of the courthouse. The amount of media has doubled, possibly tripled. National media organizations have started showing up, waiting for a verdict. There's been kind of a core group of 12 to 13 of us for this entire trial, and now that has shifted. And there's definitely just a shift in the air. Testimony is done. We have closing arguments, and now it's this air of anticipation, waiting for a verdict.
Right. And so let's talk about going back to Monday. The final experts for the defense testified, and this was we've been saying it's turned into a real battle of the experts because people who testified for the defense who were not hired by the defense were highly credentialed. Let's talk about their testimony.
Yeah, there were two men who testified from this organization, ARCCA. It's a professional accident reconstruction organization that does independent research on accident reconstruction. They have contracts with the Department of Defense, with the government, with the NHL, you name it. So we know outside of court that they were hired by the FBI and the DOJ as a part of this federal external investigation that's going on into the state investigation of this case right now. However, the jury does not know that. So the jury is just told that they are hired by a third party. They're an independent expert, not hired by the state, not hired by the defense. And let me just note in your X tweets that you've been putting out, you said the jurors looked a little confused by that. They did. When they were testifying, yes, correct. I was hired by a independent third party. The jurors were kind of looking at each other like, your natural question is like, who?
Well, then who paid them? Right.
Who's hiring some random accident reconstruction? Right. There was confusion on those faces, which we should talk about the jury at some point as well.
Yes.
But they basically testified. They did multiple tests, and they also looked at evidence that they were given as a part of this case that included pictures, report, and they do not believe either that the damage to Karen Read's car was a result of a pedestrian crash, or the injuries to John O'Keefe was the result of a pedestrian crash. So,
interesting to note, though, they never examined Karen Read's car.
They didn't. They just looked at pictures, and that was something that the prosecutor asked on cross-examination. He said, the car's locked up in evidence. You could have gone and looked at it, and they said that wasn't necessary. The other thing that was interesting, and so they were only investigating in the scope that they were given by the FBI.
Right.
The two reconstruction tests that they performed, in addition to just looking at all the evidence, is they performed two tests. One where they basically simulated throwing a cocktail glass at the taillight to see if that would do the damage, which they said did do similar damage, but that was the first allegation of a thrown cocktail glass that we had heard in this whole trial.
Right.
And then the other
because John O'Keefe did walk out of the bar holding a glass.
Yes.
And so one theory might be if he and Karen Read were fighting outside the car, he might have thrown it at her taillight in anger, breaking it.
Exactly. And so the Commonwealth version of events is that he was still holding that glass when he was hit, which is why it was found broken next to him.
Right.
But they tested the idea of him throwing the glass at the car. The other thing they tested was what you would consider a more traditional pedestrian crash. But because his injuries were on the back of his skull, his worst break, they tested him getting hit in the back of the skull. And so again, that's not the state's theory of the case. So the state's theory of the case of John getting hit in his front, kind of being projected, that wasn't tested. That wasn't reconstructed here, but they still said they don't believe the physics add up and that would be possible.
Right. He had quite a straight laceration gash on the back of his skull in those autopsy photos. And the question is where that came from.
Right. And the Commonwealth says it came from him falling back and landing on the hard ground.
What did you think of the two final arguments from each side? Closing statements.
Honestly, fascinating in that typically, it's important for people to remember the defense has no burden of proof in a trial like this. The defense doesn't have to, they don't have to tell a story. They don't have to explain what happened. All they have to do is show you that the Commonwealth's case isn't strong. But here, the two closing arguments were two completely different narratives of what happened on the same night. The defense went so far as to fully tell the jury what they believe happened. And they believe that Brian Higgins lured John O'Keefe from the bar back to 34 Fairview on purpose, that he and Brian Albert, the homeowner, took John O'Keefe to a different room, beat him, he fell. Somehow, Chloe, the German Shepherd, their dog, got a hold of his arm and had to be pulled off. Then later that morning, they say, they pulled a Ford Edge up in front of the house. Remember that plow driver testified to seeing a Ford Edge parked in front of the house that morning?
Right.
Alan Jackson, the defense attorney, said they pulled that Ford Edge in front of the house, right in front of where John's body was found, to block the area as they drag his body from the basement across the front lawn and lay it in the place where it's ultimately found.
And the plow driver also testified to not remembering seeing a body on the front lawn.
Right. He said he did not see a body on the front lawn at 2:45 or 3:30 when he drove by. But he did see a Ford Edge parked in front of the area where John's body was later found.
Right.
And so, I mean, that's an entire narrative of what the defense believes happened.
That's a whole detailed story about what happened.
The prosecution,
and they don't have to provide a motive either per se for the fight, right? They just think that.
No, exactly. I mean, again, they don't have any burden. Brian Higgins is not on trial here.
Right.
And the judge did point out, which judges always do to the jury, closing arguments are not evidence.
Yep.
But it is the lawyer's attempts to weave the story together. So then the prosecutor gets up and he starts, and his first line is, I hit him, I hit him, I hit him, I hit him. And he goes and puts a timeline, a recreated timeline up on the screen, and takes the jury through the afternoon before John died, through hours after he died the following morning. The fights they were having, the exact moments they're in certain places, the exact moments he believes that Karen guns it in reverse and hits John, leaving him there to die. Multiple smaller pieces of evidence that maybe hadn't connected until his closing argument about why he believes that Karen Reed knew what she had done, including that she never called 911. She spent a lot of time calling her parents that night. An allegation that she maybe drove back by the crime scene before discovering John's body an hour later.
And he used his own words against her as testified to by the EMTs and 4 different people who were there on the scene.
Absolutely. I hit him. Is he
she
dead?
Said, I hit him.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
And so that's why I think that the closing arguments were stunning, and that it was the same 24 hours of events, but 2 completely different versions.
We can't see the jury, but you're there in the courtroom. Did you get any sense of the physical reaction or facial expressions of jurors?
So those closings, no. So the defense's closing, there was only one picture that they used up on the screen. So it was really just Alan Jackson talking. And because of that, the jurors were just focused on his face the whole time. Something about this jury, I rarely noticed them look at Karen Reed. Like, I can only imagine if I were on a jury, I'd be spending probably a lot of time looking at the defendant.
Right.
I don't see that from this jury. They're looking at the witnesses. They're looking at the lawyers. That could be based on where she's positioned, but it's definitely interesting. And then for Adam Lally's, he had a visual aid. So their eyes were on the screen most of the time, watching the timeline pass by. Interesting.
Okay, let's take a quick break. We're talking to WBZ's Kristina Rex about the final stage here of the Karen Reed trial. When we come back, we will talk about the jurors, the jury, what happens going forward as we begin deliberations, and what the judge instructed them. We'll be right back. And we are back with WBZ's Kristina Rex talking about the Karen Reed trial. So as the testimony and evidence were complete, it was time for the closing statements, and then the judge gave the jury instructions. And this went on for quite some time. What was notable about how she instructed the jury?
Well, I actually would love to interlude before that.
Yes.
Before those instructions even happened, before those closing arguments even happened, that was all delayed because we lost another juror in this case on the final day of trial. And that
Any
just feels
indication
like,
of why?
No, we never get to know why in any official capacity. But this was, when I told you about jury reactions in these weeks, this was the juror I was looking at. This woman was very reactive with her face. She's someone whose reactions I noticed often.
Really expressive.
Very expressive. And she was excused right before closing arguments. She was pulled up to sidebar with the judge and interviewed and ultimately excused. So that brought
something went on with that.
Totally. After 9 weeks of trial to then get excused right before closings. And she didn't look happy. That woman did not look happy.
Right.
She had her arms crossed. She was like very physically, she looked frustrated.
Her body language, she was annoyed because two other female jurors had been dismissed in the last few weeks.
One man and one woman, actually.
One man and one woman. Okay,
Yes.
This was the second woman. So we started out with 17 jurors in all because it's such a high-profile case.
Correct.
So now we're down to the 14.
Yeah.
And the judge chooses the foreperson.
Yes, and she just picked the person sitting in the first seat, a man sitting in the first seat.
Was a man there. And then how are the other 11 jurors chosen?
So actually 2 alternates were chosen basically out of a hat. It's like one of those wooden lottery boxes, bingo boxes. And so their numbers were just chosen out of a hat. And the 2 alternates are 2 women. So after this larger jury that was very imbalanced, a lot more women than men, at the end of the day, the deliberating jurors are 6 men and 6 women.
Interesting.
By random.
As fair as you can get in terms of gender bias. Right.
Completely at random. So anyway, I'm sorry, that was such a distraction.
No. But that is interesting that final juror was dismissed and she clearly did not look happy about it.
Right.
Let's go over the charges again.
Yep.
Just to remind people.
In the indictment, Karen Reed is charged with second-degree murder, manslaughter while OUI, and leaving the scene of an accident or leaving the scene of personal injury or death is the technical charge. As a result, during their deliberations, and the jurors learned about this when the judge gave them instructions, there are what's known as the lesser included offenses that they can consider as well. So, for example, if manslaughter while OUI includes some element of intent or intentionally committing this crime, they can instead consider a charge with recklessness. And if they don't have enough for that, they can consider a charge where it's negligent motor vehicle homicide. So almost moving down in the mindset ranks, the jurors are given the option, if they can't find the highest charge beyond a reasonable doubt, they can consider a lower charge.
Interesting. And also on the leaving the scene of the accident, right? Because, I mean, this is someone who's facing the possibility of life in prison.
Yes. And Alan Jackson said this at one point in arguments, not closing arguments, a different point in trial. He said, every one of these charges and the Commonwealth's entire theory rests on John O'Keefe getting hit with Karen Reed's car, which is true. I mean, every single one of these, the jury has to believe that Karen Reed hit John O'Keefe with her car.
Whether she intended to or not.
Exactly. There's no charge they could convict her of without believing that car accident happened.
There's no wiggle room. And in terms of the defense theory of that whole fight situation, there was no one who testified and there was no evidence that put John O'Keefe inside the house. Right.
Correct. Everyone testified that he never came in the house.
Right. So that's another interesting wrinkle in all of this. So the jury has the case now. It's in their hands. They deliberated for a couple of hours yesterday afternoon.
About 2.5 hours,
before breaking for the day. So they continue for this first full day. What are your thoughts as we head into watching the length of deliberations?
A real stunning moment from closing that I forgot to tell you about is that 4 witnesses in the case showed up with the O'Keefe family for closing arguments.
Talk about that.
Brian Albert, the homeowner, Jen McCabe, the woman who infamously Googled how long to die in the cold at a debated time, Colin Albert, who was a teenager at the time, and Carrie Roberts, who was the other woman with Karen Reed when she found John O'Keefe. They all showed up to court yesterday with the O'Keefe family and sat with them in court during closing arguments. So there's 2 sides of that, right? Are they so ready for this case to be over and they've been through a lot and they're supporting the O'Keefes and the O'Keefes support them and they want to see justice? If you ask Karen's attorney, they are trying to intimidate the jury by being there.
Oh, interesting.
That's what he told me after court. So that was a real stunning moment.
Right. On the O'Keefe's part and the Albert's part, they're trying to show a coalition of support there to sort of say to the jury, silently, we don't agree as his family with this whole narrative that the defense.
Right. We have nothing to hide. We're here.
Right.
Yeah. And who knows? Who knows if the jury even noticed that they were there or remembered their faces?
Yeah.
But it's a small courtroom, so it's highly likely.
Really interesting. But also, as we've been talking to our reporter Penny Commit, who's in the morning, and you, the crowd has grown substantially this week, not just with media outlets, but hundreds of people, Free Karen Read supporters, some people who we've spoken to who have flown in from Tennessee, from
all over
Michigan.
the country.
People are following this story all over the country. Obviously, it's social media driven. But why do you think this human drama has captured people's imagination so much?
To a degree, especially the group who is here outside every day, I think they're a part of something, right? Yeah. For them, this has become a community. I had spoken to, Jeff Zidell. He's a psychologist who we interview sometimes. He said people want to be a part of something. And that's kind of how these movements happen. And at this point, this narrative about a cover-up, it's been really widespread, not in that courtroom, outside of that courtroom.
Right.
That's the narrative that is captured on social media. And a lot of times, as a result, the victim can kind of be forgotten in all of this at times.
Be forgotten. And we've talked about that, a man died here. His parents were sitting there having to listen to all this, which is awful. But the a column by Adrian Walker in the Boston Globe today, the state police are already big losers in the Karen Read trial because of some of the text messages that were read aloud and the behavior pointed out by the attorneys. It has left the Massachusetts State Police with quite a black eye.
Yeah, and once the verdict comes in, I'm sure journalists, myself included, will be demanding some answers from them. Yeah. They've all kind of said we want to wait for a verdict, but okay, is there going to be any accountability for bad behavior?
Yeah,
that's important regardless of what happens in this case.
Governor Healy weighed in when she was asked about those text messages that were read aloud by the lead investigator, Michael Proctor, and said she was disgusted by them. So clearly this is going to have reverberations well beyond just this trial and way after the verdict is in. Is there anything that I missed that you want to make sure we cover before we go?
I just think as far as waiting for a verdict, I think a lot of people, especially the people who are here outside to support Karen Read, this might be the first murder trial they're following. Yeah. And, they think, the evidence, the reasonable doubt is so overwhelming, she should be acquitted within 30 minutes. Even if that's true, that's just not how this works.
Right.
These jurors were instructed by the judge to look over all the evidence, over 650 exhibits of evidence that they're given. They listened intently for 9 weeks. I don't think they're going to come to a rash decision here. They were instructed to take the time and talk through it. So I just don't think people should read too much into them taking their time deliberating.
The length of hours. And, as you pointed out from observing them in the courtroom, and anybody who has served on a jury or knows someone who has, people are investing so much time of their lives in this. When they're on a jury, they take it very seriously. There is no way around it that the seriousness of what you're doing really comes home to people when they're in that jury box. And this is what our whole system rests upon, right? So,
absolutely.
Well, Kristina Rex, outstanding work on these 9 weeks covering the trial. And we know you're going to continue as that verdict comes in. I should say, as soon as there is a verdict, we will be live on WBZ-TV. We'll also be streaming on CBS News Boston. It's a good time to download our CBS News app, so you'll get the alerts when the verdict is in. And of course, we'll have complete and full coverage of the reaction to the verdict, whatever the case may be. So WBZ's Kristina Rex, thanks again.
Thanks, Paula.
Thank you.